Hello and welcome to this video. I'm your host Joshua Yen of the Philosophy for All podcast, and today we have the great privilege to have Dr. Taylor Carman onto the channel to talk about Heidegger. Dr. Taylor Carman is a professor of philosophy at Barnard College of Columbia University and specializes in continental philosophy with specific reference to Heidegger. I really enjoyed reading his works during my course on Heidegger, so I thought it would be wonderful if you could come on and share his knowledge. Dr. Taylor Carman, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you.
So to get us started, who was Martin Heidegger?
Well, Martin Heidegger is considered by many, but not all, to be the or one of the most important philosophers of the 20th century. He was a German philosopher. He was born in 1889. He lived until 1976. And he really shaped the history of European philosophy for most of the 20th century, or let's say second half of the 20th century or so, or last 3/4 of it or so, or something like that. Many movements that came after him were really kind of in the shadow of his work, whether they were sympathetic or reacting to, or he's a kind of necessary reference point for 20th century, and I think still 21st century European philosophy. Whether you agree with him or disagree with him, he's a figure sort of on the order of Nietzsche or Hegel or Kant, who really shape the rest of the discourse for a century or so afterwards. That's a very loose description of his importance, but we can talk more about why he's so important. But that's his time span and his influence, which is hard to overstate. I think some people would say, and I guess I'm one of them, that Wittgenstein and Heidegger were the two most important or greatest philosophers of the last century.
That's a brilliant introduction, and we will get into perhaps some of his influences later on in this interview. But to get started off, when people think about Heidegger, people often talk about the question of being. What does being in the world mean? But before we get into that, why did Heidegger care so much about the question of being? Was there anything which came to mind to say, well, this is something that we do need to recover and actually get to the bottom of in philosophy?
I think he thought it was important because it's the most fundamental question that we can ask. So anything you talk about at all is going to make some reference to being. Presumably, if you're talking about reality or the world or in any form, even numbers, for example, presumably there are numbers, and you just can't get around the concept, if it's a concept, but let's say you can't get around our basic understanding that something is or isn't, or that there is something. Sometimes Heidegger would say the most fundamental question, or the fundamental question of metaphysics, which we can talk about that in a few minutes too, is, and this is a very famous question, it's become more and more popular, partly because of Heidegger, but he wasn't the first person to pose it exactly. But he sometimes says the fundamental question of traditional philosophy, whether it's stated or not, is the question, why is there something rather than nothing? Why is there anything rather than nothing? And that's a pretty mind-boggling question. There are books written about it, and people have a lot to say about it. It's unclear what you could say about it that would be an adequate answer, like an explanation. I mean, you might say, well, God created everything. But of course, that's question begging, because why is there God? And if you say God created himself, you then have a job to do explaining how that's even conceivable. And it looks like things are no less mysterious if you say God was a self-creating entity, which is a traditional theological idea, than that you say there was nothing and then there was something, or there just is something. In fact, it's even not, now Heidegger doesn't maybe go down this road too much, but you can, if you're really interested in this question for its own sake, you could also ask yourself what we even mean if we say that there might have been nothing, because what would that have been like? I mean, is there a possible universe in which there was nothing? But if there was a universe in which there was nothing, then there was a universe. So one line of thought maybe is that it's not even conceivable that there has to be something, because we don't even have a clear concept of what it would be for there to be nothing. So that's the importance of the question of being. But Heidegger's question of being is not that exactly. He uses that as a kind of entree into the question which he thinks is the real question, which is when we say is or are or exists or be, what are we even saying? What do those words even mean, or what do they point to, or what kind of meaning do they presuppose? Like, why is there anything? His question is really more about what that word is might be doing. Like, what do we even mean when we say that there is anything or that there is something? So he likes to say early on, and for example, in his magnum opus of his early thought, Being and Time, that the real question, the deep question of philosophy is, what is the meaning of being? And he doesn't mean the meaning of the words, as I was using the words as a kind of heuristic to sort of get into the question. But it's not a semantic question about the meaning of the word is or are or be. Those are, the words function differently in different natural languages. But it's more like what we understand when we say things like that. What do we understand when we say words like that? Or when we just apprehend that there is anything at all? What is it that we're understanding? So he wasn't devoting his work to trying to answer the question, why is there something rather than nothing? But he was very interested in the fact that we can frame that question, and that it shows that we have an understanding of being, which means we grasp it somehow. And he wants to know what we're grasping or understanding when we understand that. But the importance of it is its fundamentality. It's like it's hard to think of any kind of concept or idea or content of our understanding that's any more basic than that. Because almost for anything, if you're going to take it seriously as a subject matter of thought, you want to say there's some sense in which it is, so that you can think about it. Even if it's like, are there numbers, or is there God? And even if you don't believe that there are numbers or God, or unicorns, that's something you understand. You understand them maybe by denying their being or existence, and that's still interesting. So that's really, it's the meaning of being that's the big question for him.
So when we think about Heidegger, and when someone picks up a copy of Being in Time and tries to understand it, of course, that's quite a difficult task, as I figured out when I first picked up Heidegger's Being in Time at the start of this term. One gets the idea of a capitalized being, almost as Dasein, is with a capital B or a capital D, as if it's a proper noun in some sense. And initially, some people might confuse that, or at least have connotations for those coming perhaps from the philosophy of religion of the God, where people like to describe God with that capitalized B. How are we meant to understand the capitalization on that B and the emphasis that Heidegger puts on this word?
Right. So that is a convention of translation from German into English, which I think is very unfortunate because it causes so much confusion. And so I maybe need to say a little bit about what these words are in German to make more sense of it. So, but just to go back to the English for a minute, what you'll notice in the translation of Being in Time and other translations, not all of them, but many translations of Heidegger, draw this distinction, as you said, between big B being and little b being. Now, you're absolutely right that when you capitalize words in English, it has some kind of rhetorical force, implying that you're talking about something really substantial or important. And especially, as you say, you might think that we're talking about the supreme being. But now that's already the wrong concept of being. That's not really what Heidegger means. And let me also just say, in German, all nouns are capitalized. So capitalization doesn't have the same significance in German that it has in English. I actually think to translate these words into English, we ought not to capitalize them unless we absolutely have to, because it carries this extra weight in English that it doesn't have in German. But the distinction is marking the following distinction. If anybody who's listening has some German, you know that what we call big B being, which is really what Heidegger's talking about, the word for that is sein. And it is capitalized because it's a noun, but it's just the infinitive form of the verb to be made into a noun. So of course it's capitalized. What's often translated as lowercase b being is das Seiende. And now that's a singular noun, but it means whatever there is, which means entities. And it can mean a single entity, but it can also just mean everything that is. But the very crucial distinction he's drawing between those two words is that the entities are the things that are. You can name them. You can make a list, a long list. You won't ever make a complete list of entities, but they're books and tables and people and numbers and riots and revolutions and planets and, whatever you like. Those are things that are or that exist in some sense. And now, what they kind of have is being. I mean, being is that in virtue of which entities are entities. But being, Heidegger says, to be, Dasein, is not itself an entity. It's not a thing that exists. It is the being of anything that does exist. Now, I think it's much better to translate Sein into English as entities, especially when you're speaking, because you can hear the difference right away between entities and being, and you're not going to mix them up. But especially when we're speaking, you can't hear upper and lowercase letters when we're speaking, so you often don't know which one we're talking about. So I always say, and I always write entities as opposed to being, and then there's no reason to capitalize the word being. So I just say being for Sein. And it's really not entities that Heidegger's interested in, with the exception of us, Dasein, and we can come back to that. But he's interested really in even Dasein, or human beings, just because we, they, us, are the entity that has an understanding of being. And that makes us really unique and special and interesting. And the reason that the book Being in Time is all about Dasein, which is human beings, us, is the reason it's about us is because Heidegger wants to know the meaning of being, and we are the entity that has some understanding of the meaning of being. So it's really the meaning of being that he's interested in, more than anything like human nature or what is a person or anything like that. But the question of being is, what is it to be? And that's a better way to put it, because you'll notice that what I said was to be, which is, again, the infinitive of the verb. So when I say, what is it to be, that is not a question that's directly about an entity, right? That's about any entity insofar as it is an entity, namely that it is. That's what I want to know about. I want to know about the that it is rather than isn't. So that's the distinction he's drawing. So when we say entity, or when we say being, like in English, we often say being when we mean entity, of course. When we say, like, I'm a rational being, right? God is the supreme being. In both of those cases, we're talking about an entity. And that's not mostly what Heidegger's talking about. He's talking about what makes an entity, like either of those entities, an entity, right? That it is. That's the idea.
Yes. So for Heidegger, you've raised this idea of interpreting humans or human beings are that which can kind of make a stand on their own being, or have an understanding of their own being. I was wondering perhaps whether you could talk a bit about what form or what mode of that interpretation of our being is, because if you look back, I guess some people might be coming at this from a Cartesian point. There's always this bird's eye view of the world, that you have this impersonal mind analyzing the world, or perhaps someone's trying to understand being or the world from this kind of Hegelian kind of spirit. There's a lot of different ways people might try to engage with understanding being, or the way in which we engage with external features or phenomena in the world. How does Heidegger turn to or fit into that tradition, or how does he challenge it?
Right. Okay, so there's a missing step there, which is this, that maybe I should say a little bit about the word Dasein too, just quickly, again, for those who have a little German. The word Dasein, which is, again, capitalized because it's a noun, literally means being there. Da it's a neutral there. I mean, you say it in German even when in English we'd say here. Like if we're sitting in the classroom and if I were to say in English, I won't be here Monday, I mean, I would say bin ich da. So here, there, anywhere, da. So Dasein literally means being there, but Heidegger didn't invent this word. It's just the German word, another German word for existence. So when Kant talks about the existence of God, he's talking about das Dasein Gottes, the God's existence or being. Okay, so now so from now on, I'll just be saying Dasein when I mean us, and I think basically it means human beings. So Dasein, as I said, is the entity that has an understanding of being. And that means it has an understanding of its own being, as you said, but we're the entity that has an understanding of being generally. That is, we know what numbers are and what trees are and planets and wars and elections and cultures and musical compositions and poems. I mean, okay, this list goes on indefinitely. So we know what all those things are in some sense or other. So that's what's special about us. So now the next crucial step, and maybe this is one of the most ingenious moves at the beginning of being in time, near the beginning of being in time, Heidegger says, not only do we just happen to have an understanding of being, which you might say about like Homo sapiens as a species just does happen to have this understanding, but it's kind of, maybe a contingent fact about us. But by Dasein, he means the entity whose very being is defined by having an understanding of being. So that's a really tricky move. It's not really a claim he has a deductive argument for, but it's a kind of stipulation, right? By Dasein, he means the entity that has an understanding of being. So first of all, it's in principle possible that dolphins are Dasein, or that there's creatures on other planets that are Dasein. We don't know, and he's not really going to speculate about that. But Dasein isn't coextensive necessarily with Homo sapiens. It's the entity, happens to be us, that not only happens to have an understanding of being, but that understanding of being is definitive of its being. I mean, that's what our existence consists in, our having that understanding of being. That's what our being at all involves. So that's really crucial. So that's then again why this big book, Being in Time, 500 pages or whatever it is all about Dasein, but more specifically, Dasein's being as it involves having an understanding of being. So that sounds beginning to sound like a mouthful, but the crucial idea is that he wants to describe human existence as constituted by this understanding of being. So if we ask Dasein what is being, we're going to find out about Dasein's own being. We're finding out, or I'll put it just in the first person, we're finding out about our own being, what it is to be us, if we reflect on what we know or what we understand when we understand that there is anything, and even the kinds of things that there are. Now, that sets him up to say, in fact, de facto, our kind of being, Dasein's kind of being, which, as you mentioned it a minute ago, is being in the world, is really radically unlike the kind of being that mere objects have, objects with properties. That's been the most traditional metaphysical concept of a thing or an object or an entity, something, say, some substance with properties. We're also radically different from this other kind of entity, which is equipment or tools or things that we make use of or rely on, whose being consists in their being available for use. Hammers and nails and bicycles and money and cars and all kinds of things. So we have a unique kind of being, and further specified, as you said, is that our being, he says, is being in the world. Now that means that world is not some extra thing that's added on to Dasein. It might be and it might not be. In other words, you cannot even conceive of Dasein, that's us, unless you already understand it as being in the world. So the world comes with Dasein, and any conception of us that's abstracted from the world that we inhabit will be an impoverished and misleading and maybe just wrong conception of ourselves. Now, that is very like the conception of ourselves that Descartes had, for example, because, of course, Descartes winds up saying, of course, there's a world, but it's a world, that we nowadays say, even outside of philosophy classes, the world out there, the external world, right? Because Descartes is very committed to the idea that it's conceivable that my own inner subjective experience or my consciousness of my own mind or my own self could be just exactly as it is in principle, and there could fail to be anything external to my mind or consciousness, which is what we normally call the world. That's conceivable in principle, and it's the source of his skeptical arguments at the beginning of the Meditations. He argues himself out of that and says it's not true, but a lot of people don't think he really successfully managed to argue himself out of that. But what's, I think, more important than the skeptical arguments or whether he refutes them or not is his idea that it's conceivable. You can think of yourself and your mind and your consciousness without being committed to anything at all about the external world that you inhabit, that you take for granted as real. So Heidegger is very anti-Cartesian in that respect. Heidegger thinks you have no concept of yourself whatever if you abstract from the world. So really, world and Dasein are, it's hard to know what metaphor is most sort of like illuminating or useful, but sometimes people say two sides of a coin, which means you can't have one without the other. It doesn't make any sense to think about one without the other at all. And John Hoagland talks about two sides of a coin, and he contrasts it with this other image, which is more like the Cartesian image, which is two sort of weights on either end of a what do you call it, a barbell, right? There's a bar, and then there's the weights on either end. You can take one off and you still have the other one. It's not like that at all. It's more like two sides of a coin. It just makes no sense to talk about a coin with only one side, at least a coin the shape that we talk about. If you've got one side, you've got the other. It's a crude metaphor, but it sort of gets close to the idea. So that's the anti-Cartesian aspect of Heidegger's idea about our kind of being. We are in the world. Now, world does not mean the sum total of all entities, because he doesn't think that if there were no Dasein, that's to say, if there were no us, then there wouldn't be molecules and atoms and planets and energy and whatever. I mean, he's not an idealist in that way. So when he says being in the world, he means a world in this more ordinary sense of milieu, environment, sort of the place that you can inhabit, that's populated not just by objects with properties, but by opportunities and threats and courses of action and social roles. That's what a world is, in the sense that you get world and Dasein mutually intertwined with each other, and you can't have one without the other. So he's not saying that the world as described by physics depends on Dasein or is the other half of the coin. He means an inhabitable world, a social world, a historical world, a cultural world. And remember, I mean, notice how ubiquitous and familiar this concept of world is in ordinary language. I mean, there's the academic world, right? It's now common to talk about the world of antiquity or the world of the Renaissance, but there's the business world. There used to be on TV the wide world of sports. There's, so worlds are environments that are human worlds because they're defined by how they are inhabited by people. So that's the kind of world he's talking about when he says that our being is being in the world.
That's a very fascinating idea, and perhaps we could discover or explore some aspects of what you've just said. You've raised the idea of equipment and their availability to us, and also some of the social roles that occur in this world. Can you perhaps tell us a bit more about how does Heidegger envision us engaging with equipment and engaging with these social roles, and how does that engagement tell us about a bit more about the truth of the world, or the nature of the world as it is?
Yeah, so one way to put it would be to say the fundamental way in which we interact with or inhabit a world that's full of things we make use of or rely on is that we're doing that in a kind of, you might almost say, mindless way, but that's a little too strong. It doesn't mean mindless like we're zombies, but non-cognitive, let's say. I don't relate to hammers and nails and my shoes and socks and toothbrush and the hallway I walk down and the doorknob I grab, and again, the list goes on and on. I don't make use of those things by having what philosophers like to call beliefs and desires that are mental attitudes with propositional content and logical structure. I don't have to be thinking in that kind of way in order to be doing the things I do when I put my shoes on and tie the laces. it's something I know how to do. I just do it. And it's not as if I believe as I walk down the street that there's a sidewalk under my feet. You know, you can do this sort of like, it's not exactly a thought experiment, but just a sort of reflective test. I sometimes ask my students when they walked into the classroom, did they believe there was a floor in the room? There's different kinds of responses you could have to that question. One would be to say, well, I guess I must have, because I didn't hesitate to step into the room, right? But notice that that's an inference you're now making retrospectively, thinking, I guess I had a belief. But that answer already shows you that there's something strange about the question, because when you walked into the room, I think the right thing to say is it didn't even occur to you to wonder or question whether there was a floor in the room. So I think there's something a little suspicious about insisting that you knew or believed that there was a floor in the room. I think the right thing to say is you know how to walk into a room. And the intelligence that you're exercising, because of course these actions are all intelligent. Heidegger thinks, by the way, that human beings have a kind of intelligence which is unlike any other animal's intelligence. So our intelligence is special and it is ubiquitous, but there's a kind of knowledge that we have in, again, walking on the ground or breathing in the air or turning your head to see where a sound is coming from that don't involve rational, discursive thinking, as philosophers have usually thought of it. Now, one way to describe this is to appeal to a distinction that Gilbert Ryle draws between knowing how and knowing that. And the knowing that is the propositional that, like knowing that the sky is blue or knowing that 2 + 2 is 4. Call that propositional knowledge or knowing that. That, Ryle says, is different from knowing how to ride a bicycle, knowing how to play the piano, knowing how to speak French. And I think Heidegger's point about our engagement with equipment, which is, as he says, ready to hand or available for use, is a lot like what Ryle meant by knowing how. You know how to do something, but that's not the same as knowing that such and such is the case. For example, when I'm tying my shoes, I don't think I have any particular belief that the shoelaces exist or that they won't turn to butter as I'm tying them up, or that they won't fly away, or anything like that. All of these are fanciful, reflective possibilities that you can entertain on reflection, but I don't think anything like that really plays a role in your ordinary practical engagement with the world. So that's the first thing to say, is these practical, engaged attitudes are a kind of foundation, a different kind of intelligence, which is foundational in relation to propositional attitudes like belief and desires that have propositional content, like I want that job, that kind of propositional belief. There's desires that are more like appetites, which maybe are a different issue, but when philosophers talk about belief-desire pairs, they're talking about attitudes with propositional contents. So I think Heidegger said this stuff about the ready-to-hand equipment and its availability before Ryle drew this distinction between knowing how and knowing that. And Ryle had read Being in Time, so maybe it had some influence on him. But I think it's very similar distinction.
So perhaps, and when you were discussing the different categories just now, you talked about how Dasein is sort of a different category and of a different nature to tools and equipment. But is there a way in which, I suppose, Dasein can engage with other Dasein, but treat the other Dasein as perhaps a tool, as something ready to hand? How does that relationship
That's interesting.
work?
Heidegger doesn't say a lot about that explicitly, but I think implicitly in what he's saying, I think it's not hard to see what his answer would be. And I think his answer would be something like this. The kinds of things we're describing when we say one person, uses or exploits another or treats them as if they're just a tool. If you think of slavery or, all kinds of violence and oppression, aren't people just treating each other as if they're tools and so on? I think that has to be kind of metaphorical, because if you really look at what's going on in those kinds of human relationships, you will see that they presuppose a background understanding that this is a human being, and that therefore you don't and cannot treat them as if it really is just true that they are a tool or instrument. I mean, that you have to force them and intimidate them and threaten them. All of those kinds of attitudes presuppose recognizing something like their humanity or their Daseinhood, right?
Yeah.
So I think there is there are such relations that are relations of oppression and violence and so on. But if you examine them very closely, you'll see that they are ways of debasing and exploiting and violating the being that you have to understand that they already have.
Mm.
That's why slaves are enslaved rather than just
Mm.
utilized.
Yes.
I mean, you don't have to threaten a rock or a stick or an arrow um, at all because
Mm.
you recognize that their kind of being is being available for use. Whereas
Mm.
when you have to threaten and intimidate and brutalize a human being, you do that because you're recognizing that it's a human being you are dealing with. So I don't think he thinks that the ontological categories, as you say, are actually particularly blurry. I think,
Mm.
and I think he's right about that. I mean, like I say, he doesn't come out and say that exactly, but that's his point is to say it's the very being of these things that is different. This is not just a function of our subjective attitudes. Um, you can, if you want, try to regard a person as a mere object or as a tool, but you're never really going to succeed in doing that. I mean, again, if we describe the situation adequately, we'll see that what you are doing is trying to treat a person as a thing or a tool.
Mm.
Unless you are just so completely wildly mistaken. I mean, you can also invent these scenarios where, you're walking down the street and you see a shop window and there's a mannequin in the shop window, it's exhibiting some outfit, clothes or a hat or something, and you're stepping up to the window and looking at it very closely because you think it's a mannequin, and then it moves when you see it as a person.
Mm.
That's that. Now, what happens when you'll probably startle, right? That's an innocent mistake. It's not like the situations I think you had in mind at all. And there it was the case that you were wrong about what entity this was and what kind of being it had. I think the startle reaction is kind of significant because it shows you that you have to fundamentally readjust your attitude to this thing. You would not have stepped up as closely and merely looked at the elbow or the shoulder or whatever, ignoring the face, if you thought this was a person. You would already have approached it differently, recognizing that it's a person. But once you recognize it as a person, you kind of can't unsee that. And you've learned about it. So of course we can be mistaken about particular things and what they are, and therefore what kind of being they have. But those differences, those what he calls ontological differences, are rock bottom. Those are foundational, and those
Mm.
don't move around because of our subjective attitudes.
So we've talked a bit about how being engages and discovers the world. Now, in Heidegger, there's also a concept of inauthentic engagement with the world and an authentic engagement with the world. And in some aspects, Heidegger almost seems to talk about the inauthentic engagement of the world as almost a necessary category or an
Mm.
existential of Dasein. I was wondering perhaps whether you could tell us a bit more about that inauthentic form of engaging with the world and how does that occur when we're engaging with the world?
Okay, so there's a kind of inconsistency in being in time. So
Mm.
first of all have to point this out, that by the time you get to the second half of the book, which we call it Division 2 of Being in Time, it sounds like he's just distinguishing the inauthentic way of being in the world from the authentic way of being in the world, which is too bad. He was writing the second half quickly in order to get tenure, and it's sloppier than the
Mm.
first half. So that's a bit of an excuse, maybe. But I think in a way it's in part just a verbal sort of confusion, because earlier in the book he says that there are actually three different modes. There's authentic and inauthentic, and then what he calls this indifference, or you might say undifferentiated kind of being in the world. So I think in Division 1 he recognizes that there are ways of being in the world, and our normal, ordinary, average, everyday being in the world is the undifferentiated. It's undifferentiated with respect to inauthenticity or authenticity. And that means that, like, I speak my native language as one does, I dress normally, I go about my business as people do, I'm conforming to the norms of my culture. Um, that's that's not particularly authentic or inauthentic. It's what he calls average everydayness, which is really what he's talking about in the first half of Being in Time. Because inauthentic sounds bad. We have to come back to this question about, is authenticity sounds like something good, inauthenticity sounds like something bad. But he's not saying that what's sort of foundational and basic, or at least salient upon first examination, is the inauthentic. Like I say, in Division 2, it starts sounding like he's talking that way. But I think that's just because he's using the word inauthentic to kind of cover both the undifferentiated and the inauthentic in a pejorative sense kind of inauthenticity. So the first thing to say is that I do think what he thinks is, in a way, now basic can mean different things. So basic in a certain sense, like when you first look at Dasein and its being in the world, this is what you notice. It's ubiquitous, and it is necessary. There's no escaping it. This undifferentiated, banal, conforming to the conventions and practices and the understanding of the world and yourself that you have thanks to your culture and your place in history and so on. I do think he thinks there's no escaping that. And in fact, it is even defined by, as he says, doing what one does. So the one, or the anyone, I talk like anyone talks, I dress like anyone dresses, I get a job and I do what one does. We all are like that. We're all conformists of a certain kind. But so call that conformity. Nothing bad about it, nothing good about it. It's just the human condition. Now, that's very important insight just already. And I do think it sort of warrants some comparison with Wittgenstein when he talks about rule following and speaking a language, that you just, to be doing it at all, you have to be conforming to something like a practice or a custom. There's no way for one single isolated mind or consciousness to be doing anything like that on its own. It has to be in the kind of social context. So that's fundamental. Okay, that said, and recognizing that there's no getting out of that, I think in that kind of world in which there's no alternative to some kind of conformity to the world you're in, you can inhabit that world authentically or inauthentically. So we'll first talk about the normatively loaded sense of those words, just very quickly, and then I want to problematize that a little bit. So yeah, the thing about conformity to norms, which you cannot get out of, is that it can sort of slip into what you might call conformism. And again, I owe that distinction, that verbal distinction in English, again, to John Hoagland, who and Bert Dreyfuss used to talk this way, that conformity, fine, neither good nor bad. Conformism is bad because that means something like doing what one does because that's what one does, as if that's your sort of basic motivation, is to be normal, to do as what you think is proper or appropriate. If that's your, as it were, fundamental reason for doing that, then you're failing to be yourself in some sense. You're failing to pursue a certain kind of selfhood that you might have if you projected yourself into your life and your future in a way that you were taking responsibility for as your own, which is already a kind of a description of authenticity. So the inauthentic way of being in the world is the conformist, conforming for the sake of conformity, and that's it. And now Heidegger didn't invent that notion. I mean, you find that in a lot of different thinkers and under different names. Kierkegaard talks this way. Many do. I think Tocqueville, when he talks about democracy, is worried about this kind of conformism. There's others who have, noticed it. It's a tendency of human beings to get in line with the herd, as it were, right? To put it really pejoratively. So authentic is some kind of ideal of being yourself. But once we put it that way, that's potentially misleading, because that may make you think that there's some truth already established about yourself or who you are or your identity, and you have to discover that and then just accept it. But the Heidegger doesn't believe anything like that is right. So being yourself means something like being serious about your commitments, which you freely take up in the context of the world you are thrown into and that you have to sort of respond to according to its normative structure. So there's these two aspects of existence. One is that you're thrown into a world that you have to deal with, that was
Mhm.
not up to you and you can't choose, and many aspects of which you'll never be able to change. But then you also project into possibilities that are offered to you in that world. The range of opportunities or possibilities is not infinite. I mean, Don Quixote is a nice example of somebody who's trying to press into possibilities which are no longer part of the world he's in. He
Mhm.
wants to be a knight errant and be rescuing damsels in distress from giants and so on. But in fact, it's windmills he's fighting against, and there are no damsels in distress, and
Mhm.
so he looks like he's crazy. So you and I couldn't be a knight errant, or or the emperor of Rome, or whatever.
Mhm.
There's all kinds of possibilities which are no longer given to us in the world we're in. You might be an entrepreneur or a professor, but you're not going to be all kinds of things that people could be in other centuries and other ages. So authenticity is owning up to the situation you're in. That's what he calls resoluteness. Being serious and honest with yourself about the circumstances you're facing, and then to have what he calls anticipation or forerunning into the possibilities you've taken up as yours, which will define you. So
Mhm.
there's a strong component of freedom, but it's very situated freedom. And to have both of those aspects, like seriousness about the unique situation you're facing, because you can be inauthentic and say to yourself, "Oh, I've read about this kind of situation. Here's what you're supposed to do in this situation. That's what I'll do." That's
Mhm.
inauthentic. The resolute situation is, I don't know, somebody needs my help, or there's something now I see that I've got to do, but it's unlike any situation I've ever quite been in, because every situation is sort of unique. And to be serious about that situation, that's resoluteness. And then also to have a kind of what I would call wholeheartedness. That's my
Mhm.
word for what Heidegger calls forerunning, or in the standard translation, it's anticipation, which just means kind of spontaneity, a kind of like making kind of leap of commitment into a future possibility. That's what he means by authentic. It's important to know, to remember, authentic, again, in German, it's eigentlich, uh, which can just mean actual, but that's not what Heidegger means by it. Eigentlich has eigen built into it, which refers to what's your own.
Mhm.
And so you're coming into your own, and you might say, to exploit some other idioms, you're owning up to your situation and owning yourself and your choices and so on. It doesn't mean authentic like there's an authentic Rembrandt, which means
Mhm.
Rembrandt really painted it. Because
Mhm.
the opposite of authentic in that sense is like fake or forgery or something. So he's not talking about being real as opposed to being fake. He's talking about being your own person. That's something like the idea. Um,
Mhm.
but he
Now,
does.
Mhm.
Let me just say, the reason I started with the fundamentality of the undifferentiated is
Mhm.
because he doesn't think, and he can't really afford to say that it's inevitable that we're inauthentic,
Mhm.
right? I mean, it has to be that we can be genuinely authentic. Um, and I suppose in principle, you could be authentic, from day one all through your whole life. It's not going to be typical. But what is foundational is the world and the normative structure of the world that you respond to in being either authentic or inauthentic. You can't do without that. You could, in principle, do without slipping into conformism and inauthenticity, but so that's an important distinction to draw.
Mhm. I think that recognition of the undifferentiated is quite helpful in reading Heidegger, especially when I guess a lot of times when you're reading, perhaps even in secondary literature, of the idea of Das Man or the they being tied directly to inauthenticity, and the idea that there is either you're inauthentic or you're authentic, and there really is no other way around that, and perhaps
Yeah,
that
and
undifferentiated
it's a point
character.
you really have to make. I mean, I make it over and over again when I teach Being in Time. Imagine the most authentic person you could imagine. They're speaking a language they inherited. They're pursuing some project that's got some kind of antecedents, like Van Gogh was being an artist.
Mhm.
Um, Martin Luther was trying to be a good Christian. Um, these were things they inherited from their world, and they are always in some sense doing as one does up to a point. And only thanks to the fact that there are those possibilities offered to them in the worlds they were inhabiting can they be authentically who they are? So being authentically who you are does not mean, divorcing yourself or tearing yourself away from your world altogether. I mean, if you did that, you would be incomprehensible to everybody else, and I think you would be incomprehensible to yourself. So the world, again, plays an absolutely essential role in even the most extreme kinds of authentic, call it individualistic, resolute, and maybe original kind of people. Yeah, they're absolutely products of their world at the same time that they are being authentically who they are, and utterly nonconformist. Yeah.
So in that sense, would you say that authenticity is in some forms just it's almost a state of mind in which we engage with the world instead of necessarily the outcomes that we do? It's almost, okay, I can choose to be a painter or I can choose to be a lawyer, but there's a way in which being a lawyer is authentic, whereas there's a way in which being a lawyer is inauthentic. And I suppose the phrase in Heidegger which comes to mind, authenticity is the existential modification of Dasein, if I remember, if that's the quote, if I get that correctly.
There's 3 sentences in Being in Time which have that structure, and 2 of them say one thing, and the third one directly contradicts the other 2. So it's the one place in Heidegger, in Being in Time, you will find a blatant contradiction, and it really is maddening. And I don't have the page numbers in front of me right now, but yeah. So twice he says the authentic self is an existential modification of the one, the anyone self, right? Which is, I think, what he ought to say. It's only because there's the anyone or anybody, das Man, that anybody can be an authentic self. In Division 2 somewhere, he says exactly the opposite, which is that that the anybody self, the anyone self, or I think that's what he says, is an existential modification of the authentic self. As if, first of all, you're an authentic self, and then you kind of lapse into everydayness and worldliness and so on. And I'd like to think that was just a typo, or a sort of, he was writing too quickly, he forgot what he was saying. I don't know if it was quite easily that explainable away. But yeah, the right thing to say is that there can only be an authentic self against the background of this Das Man, which I'm calling the normative structure or texture of the world you're thrown into. But now, going back to what you were asking, I do think that authenticity is not a matter of what you accomplish. And it's also not even really a matter of whether you're acting, morally or justly or kindly or anything like that. I don't even think it's really supposed to be a moral concept at all. Instead of calling it a state of mind, because of course that's Cartesian sounding talk, we don't want to say it's just a kind of subjective attitude or inner mental state that's disconnected from your behavior. I think maybe a better way to put it would be, say, it is a style or a manner of living your life. It is and you can call it an attitude if you want, but it has to be a really robustly embodied attitude, manifest in your actions and how you live. So there's going to be publicly available to everybody else as much as it is to you. It's not an internal mental state, but it is, it's something like how you are living. And now, further specified, I would say it has these 2 characteristics. One is a certain kind of honesty about the circumstances, about the situation you're in. So you're not running away from it and telling yourself that it's something other than it is, or you're not in denial and looking away and not facing up. You're confronting or owning up to the situation. And that requires courage. So I think courage is a quality of character that's in a lot of ways very close to the idea of authenticity. So honesty and courage especially in doing what I was saying before, which is throwing yourself into passionate, as Kierkegaard would say, or wholehearted commitments, being serious about what you're committed to, and being serious and honest about the situation, the circumstances you're facing. That's how I would say, but absolutely not about success or outcome. And I don't even think it's about extraordinary creativity or originality. When Nietzsche talks about, becoming who you are, I think his paradigm examples are people who are especially creative or original, or who are changing our values in some way. That was what Nietzsche was mostly interested in. I think the banal, everyday, ordinary person who's whatever, the tax collector or the accountant or the grocer or the cab driver or the professor is not particularly interesting to Nietzsche. But I think Heidegger's closer to Kierkegaard when Kierkegaard talks about a knight of faith and says, if you saw him walking down the street, you wouldn't be able to tell him from the tax collector or the bourgeois Philistine or anything. Like, you can't tell. Now maybe that's an overstatement, because I think Heidegger doesn't think it's that deeply internal so that it can be completely hidden from other people. I think it's going to be manifest in behavior and action and so on. But I think when we meet people, we can sometimes tell if they're kind of serious characters or not right away necessarily, but if you get to know them. There's some people who are focused and honest and courageous, and they kind of know who they are and what they're about, and its authenticity is pointing to something like that. Yeah, it's hard to summarize, but I think that's the ideal. I would say too, I don't think it has anything to do with doing what's morally right. You might wish that it did, so that this could make a contribution to a concept of moral virtue. But I think it's a kind of virtue of character that's also, now I don't know if we should regret this or not. I think it's just a fact. It's compatible with people doing terrible things and being cruel and, selfish. Yeah, it's one of probably many competing and not necessarily harmonizable virtues, is what I would say. But it's not really a moral virtue. I think it's a quality of character that you can say there's something good about it, but it's not the same thing as being morally good.
That's very fascinating. And you talk about being serious, and in everyday life, it's very difficult to be more serious about a subject than the concept of death. And death is a concept that Heidegger wrestles with a lot, and especially in relationship to the concept of authenticity and inauthenticity.
Yeah.
I was wondering, perhaps before we examine the different aspects in which death is presented in Heidegger, what is the role of death in his philosophy, and what is its role in relationship to inauthenticity as kind of the next stage from our discussion?
Right. So it's the first chapter in the second division is about death. Why is it in the book at all? I think the reason it's in the book is because what he's really talking about is not death understood as the thing that happens to you, the event that happens at the end of your life. What he's talking about is what I would call your mortality, that you are mortal. That's what he's talking about. So you're not just mortal at the end of your life. You are mortal throughout your entire life. And in fact, you are what used to be called a mortal. So mortality is really what that chapter is about. And he goes to some lengths, even though people maybe don't get the message as quickly as they should, that this is not about death as the thing that happens just before you are dead. It's about your being mortal. So really, it's a way of drawing attention to the nature of our finitude, because what's really important to Heidegger in Being and Time is that Dasein's being is finite. That he's really committed to that. And the other thing that's crucial about us is the temporal structure of our existence, that we have something, we usually refer to it as past, present, and future, sort of spread out, what's called ecstatic temporality. We're thrown into a world that's the past. We're always already in a world. We're constantly pushing ahead into possibilities which define our sense of there being a future or our having a future. So the temporal finitude is your mortality. So the reason he's talking about death is because he's talking about our finitude in its temporal aspect. That's why the chapter is in the book, I think, at all. But then he has lots of interesting things to say about how to understand that. And you're absolutely right. There is an inauthentic and an authentic attitude you can have to your mortality. So I'll give you a quick preview, I guess, or a summary of what those are. Remember the doing what one does locution is a good marker for a possible kind of inauthenticity. So here's an inauthentic way of thinking about death. Everybody dies. I'm one of everybody. I'm just anybody like everybody else. So I will die. Okay. And maybe that's kind of comforting to think that. Like, I might get, in the middle of the night, if you wake up and think, oh my God, I really am going to die. My life is going to come to an end. It's easier to have that frightful sort of anxiety at night. For some reason, your brain isn't completely working in its daytime functionality, which manages to push these things out of your attention. But in the middle of the night, it becomes very clear that, oh my God, I really will be nothing. And then maybe as you wake up, you think, actually, this is what we are. Everybody is mortal and dies, and I will die too, and that's just a fact of life. And maybe you can reconcile yourself to it in a certain way. And Heidegger's not saying that's wrong or you shouldn't think that. In a way, it's perfectly correct. But notice that it's assimilating me to everybody and anybody, which means it kind of takes it off my shoulders. So now here's why I think it's important to see that inauthentic and authentic are not like vicious and virtuous. Um, uh, the reason that attitude towards your death is inauthentic is precisely just that it's kind of other directed or not focused on you as the single existing individual that you are. That's almost the definition of inauthentic. Doesn't mean it's bad or wrong. I mean, it's perfectly correct that everybody dies and you're somebody and you will die too. But if that's the only way that you think about it, you're not facing up to it authentically. To face up to it authentically is to really think my existence is finite and it is heading towards a kind of nothing or end of some kind. That's authentic just because it's referring to me, myself, and I can't pass that on to anybody else. I can't hand it off to somebody. Nobody can relieve me of the sort of burden of that recognition of my mortality. And when I do face up to it like that, and that does require a certain amount of honesty and courage, and it may be quite uncomfortable, but the fact that there's anxiety in that attitude, just that is its authenticity. So yeah, I think the more you want to kind of not think about your mortality or your death or that you won't exist someday and yada, 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 that's a kind of inauthenticity in a pejorative sense. I do think Heidegger thinks that's not as good a way to exist as to be clear-eyed and resolute and wholehearted about the finitude of your life. That's authentic. And so what I'm saying is that sometimes authentic and inauthentic do sound like something like a virtue and a vice, a good way to be and a bad way to be. Heidegger keeps saying he doesn't mean that. And I think oftentimes he does, in spite of what he says. But I think here's a case in which it's easier to see why he was insisting that it wasn't a value judgment. These are just two sort of ways to regard your life or your world. So he doesn't think you're wrong when you think, I'm like everybody else, everybody dies, and so do I. That's perfectly correct. But it covers up this fact about yourself, which is your life that's finite and will end. And that gets covered over by this kind of generic recognition that we're all mortal. He also says that anxiety just is authentic, whereas fear is inauthentic. Now, I don't think he means fear is bad, but what he means by that is fear is directed at something other than yourself. You're afraid of the tiger in the woods or the virus or your boss or whatever. It's outward directed in a certain way. It's sort of directed at some entity in the world or situation or event. And he calls that inauthentic, not because it's bad or wrong, but because it's not focused just on your own existence. But since anxiety, he says, following Kierkegaard, doesn't have an object in the world, it's this free-floating unsettledness, that's authentic. Now, it's not authentic because it's good, it's authentic because it reveals you in your being, in your existence. So sometimes authentic and inauthentic really are not even evaluative. They're not even value terms at all. They're just descriptive of directedness of attention or understanding to things in the world other than yourself, and or even aspects of yourself. You can be afraid of your own anger or afraid of whatever. But the objectless mood of anxiety is authentic, not because it's good or right, but because it does disclose your real unsettledness, which is the truth about you. Your existence is deeply unsettled.
Mhm. So we talk about death, and it's used in as almost a singular period in one's life. It's at the end. But at the same time, in some of the scholarship on literature on Heidegger, it seems that some scholars like Ian Thompson are trying to argue that death is almost this continuous state of being towards the end, or constantly being in this
Right.
state of death, which is this kind of continuous state, which is by definition almost the authentic living. But at the same time, he also says in others areas. Let me find this quote. It says, death is Dasein's own most possibility. Being towards this possibility discloses to Dasein its own most potentiality for being, in which its very being is issue. So it seems at the other times that there also is some evidence for people to view death as this instantaneous moment. So where on this spectrum do you fall, and kind of how should we navigate these two seemingly contrasting views?
Can you tell me which two you had in mind? Because I thought you were describing one view. The
Mhm.
one view is that death is the event at the end of your life, and neither
Yes.
Ian or I think that is that the
Mhm.
one of the two views,
That's one
or
of the
you?
two views. And the
Okay,
other
so the other
is
one
the
is that it's always or continuous.
That's always a continuous
Yeah,
kind of movement. And
I'm on the
I think this is mhm,
yeah, I'm on the continuous side, and Heidegger is too. I mean, this is just
mhm,
Heidegger's view. He says, and now he's quoting Saint Augustine, and there's another, I think maybe 15th century German poet he quotes who says something like, "You're dying as soon as you've been
was it
born."
Jakob Bohm by any chance?
Oh, okay, maybe. Thank you for that. I don't know if I got the century right, but yeah. So right. So that's, I think, now my saying that what he's talking about is mortality, I think makes that less paradoxical sounding. You are
Mhm,
mortal as soon as you're born. Yeah.
mm,
So it's not just that you're mortal at the end of your life. But now it's true, and you maybe were pointing out, as I was talking, when I was talking about, how to relate to your death, I kept saying your life will come to an end and someday you will be dead, and talks things like that. So Heidegger says dying is being toward the end. So
mhm,
there's some concept of end which is necessary for the concept. Um, and another way of putting this is to say there's an asymmetry, there's a temporal asymmetry, because
mhm,
my life is finite at the beginning too. Um, it's worth remembering that Epicurus, and especially it's obvious in Lucretius, they have this interesting, what's called the symmetry argument, which is you shouldn't worry about being dead because it's not going to be any different from uh, how it was before you were born, and that wasn't so
mhm,
bad, right? And I
mhm,
actually think they're right about that. I mean,
mhm,
if you disregard the asymmetry that you're heading toward the end, then yeah, how it was before I was born, fine. I mean, but the fact is there is this asymmetry, which is that you are being toward the end. I'm not being toward, the before I was born. Um, uh, so. Uh, so I do think that some notion of end has to be at play. But now this gets really subtle and tricky. I don't think the end is the moment of your death. I
mhm,
think the end is just the fact of your mortality.
mhm,
So you are being toward that throughout your life, whether you're thinking about it or not. Now, that doesn't mean you are temporally or sequentially, chronologically heading closer and closer to the moment of your death. What it means is that your mortality is a fact about your existence, which you are either owning up to or failing to own up to. And I will offer you a little sort of reflection to kind of justify this claim, because I do think it's what Heidegger means, but he could have been clearer about it. He's very clear that there's an end. He's clear that the end is not an end you can be at. So it's not
mhm,
like a finish line, and you can, because you're never at your own death. It's like the
mhm,
horizons of your visual field. You can't look at them. They're always horizontal. So, your future is horizontal in that way too. Um, uh, but here's what I think. When I've had my most kind of poignant and maybe disturbing and sad, thoughts about my mortality, there's a way in which I do feel like that in dying, I will be losing all of my life all the way back to its earliest moments. So I think Bernard Williams says something like this about why the Epicurean argument is so unpersuasive, is because sure, when I'm dead, it's true I won't be suffering anything, but to be facing death is to feel like I'm losing my whole life. And so I do think it's the totality of my existence that's at stake when I confront my mortality. I don't think it's just that I'm alive, I'm alive, I'm alive, I'm alive, and then then I'm going to be dead. It's what I'm losing is the present moment. What I'm losing is my childhood, my parents, the whole sort of panorama of this existence of mine. All my memories will disappear. I mean, I don't want to get too, sentimental about it, but I do think that's going on in your whole life, and to be inauthentically relating to that is to be putting it out of your mind and not thinking about it, and avoiding that fact. And the authentic relation to it is to own up to it and own it, and in some sense live according to or under an aspect of recognition that that's the truth about us, is that we have that kind of finitude. Yeah.
Wonderful. So we've talked a lot about Heidegger's philosophy, and perhaps it's good to take a step back from his philosophy. I think we've covered a lot of his ideas to get anyone who's interested into Heidegger, give them a good context into which one can go into Heidegger. But we've talked a lot about death, and when someone goes into Heidegger, they might have some concern when they're reading his biography that he was related somewhat to the Nazi party of his time, which of course led to a lot of death as well. Now, a lot of people might look at that and be somewhat uncomfortable, especially from the lens in which we are today, and for good reason. How should we view his relationship to the Nazi party? Does that impact his philosophy, or how are we meant to contextualize these seemingly to one guy's an influential philosopher, on the other hand, there's something really horrible going on here? How do we compare these?
Well, it's a good question, and it's a fair question, and I think the answer is kind of complicated. So there's a number of things I want to say about this. The first is that sometimes a thinker's ideas are really intertwined with their values and their actions and their beliefs in kind of horrendous ways. So let's see, I didn't prepare an example of this. What would be a good example of, well, let me just give one example of a not as well known as Heidegger, but a contemporary and somebody Heidegger knew, named Carl Schmitt, who was a legal theorist in Nazi Germany. And his legal theory was specifically designed to be a kind of justification of Nazism. So there's a case in which, you cannot subtract the political and moral content from the contribution he made, if he made one, to political philosophy or legal philosophy. There's other cases in which a philosopher's moral attitudes or political attitudes seem quite disconnected from their work, and Frege is a good example. Gottlob Frege, greatest logician in modern philosophy, was also a real nationalist and anti-Semite. And when people discovered this or became aware of it, it was quite shocking. Michael Dummett describes how dismaying it was and how it really shook his confidence in Frege's judgment and intelligence and so on. The fact is that nationalism and anti-Semitism have nothing to do with logic and the revolution in logic that Frege accomplished. So it's, in a way, not too hard to just carve that off and say, it's a terrible thing about him that he had these atrocious, horrendous views. They just don't impinge on his work in logic, I don't think. You can't do that with Carl Schmitt. You can't do it with... let's see, who's another good example? I should have thought of an obvious example. It's hard to think of people who are real monsters who also did apparently great work, but in which you just can't disentangle them at all. What would be a good example? They're totally enmeshed with each other. It's easy to think of mediocre thinkers who are awful. But let's just figure that there are some cases in which, like I say, Carl Schmitt is a kind of particular case in which the politics and the philosophy are, really closely, they're fused together. Now, the intermediate cases are more interesting and problematic. And I would suggest that Heidegger's case is somewhere falls between these two. It's not simply that the philosophy has nothing to do with his politics and his adoration of Hitler and his support for the Nazi regime, because I think there's some points at which they overlap and sort of are mutually reinforcing. There's a lot of his philosophy which doesn't do that. I think almost all of Being in Time really has virtually nothing at all to do with his enthusiasm for Nazism. Remember, Being in Time was written in 1926, published in 1927. Heidegger really only became publicly active in 1933 or so. I'm sure he had a lot of these prejudices earlier on, but people have tried to point out passages in Being in Time that indicate a kind of lurking or tacit sort of fascistic or authoritarian kind of way of thinking. I don't think it's very plausible to say fascistic or proto-Nazi. There's something kind of, now you might say it has a kind of authoritarian quality because he makes a lot of pronouncements and he just states things without providing a lot of justification or argument. So do a lot of other philosophers. So maybe that quality of character is kind of discernible in that style of presentation. That's not completely crazy. But there's a lot of the philosophy which just does not bear on politics. And I think another thing to say about that is Heidegger was not an original or creative political thinker. He didn't have interesting ideas about law or politics or government or justice or moral theory for that matter. So he was no Hegel, he was no Kant. He wasn't in their league when it comes to those aspects of philosophy. He was a lot like Wittgenstein in this way. Wittgenstein and Heidegger, neither of them thought that ethics was a part of philosophy. I mean, that's a kind of radical view, but they both thought, look, ethics, substantive ethics, is a matter for people to work out in living their lives. It's really not the business of philosophy. It's an extreme view, but Wittgenstein had that same view that Heidegger has. So I would say Heidegger's Nazism, and there's no denying that he was an enthusiastic Nazi, and there's no justifying it or forgiving it. It was horrendous and despicable. So he was a despicable person who had this great achievement in philosophy. I'd like to compare it, a kind of slightly high level of abstraction, to a similarly problematic case, which is Dostoevsky, the greatest novelists ever, and wrote what might be the greatest novel ever written, the Brothers Karamazov. He was an anti-Semite. And the anti-Semitism is not completely irrelevant to the fiction. I mean, it creeps in various places here and there, but there's a lot of the fiction which doesn't have anything to do with that. Now, so you might say, what do we do about the anti-Semitism? I think we have to just kind of accept that human beings are very complicated, especially geniuses, very complicated, and they can be extraordinarily talented in one domain and kind of stupid in another one. And this is not unusual. So it is, I think we have to, I don't want to just say grow up, but there's a certain kind of maturity that we have to have in recognizing the complexity, not just of geniuses, but of people generally, that they can be shockingly inconsistent in the depth of their insight and their sensitivity and so on. So that's a general editorial comment about this. But to go into a little bit more detail, I think it's important to recognize also, and this is not, I don't say this in a justifying or exculpating way, but again, Heidegger was incompetent when it came to politics, and not just political philosophy, but actual politics. He was the rector of Freiburg University for 1 year, from April 1933 to April 1934. That's kind of like being president of the university. It's a total failure. It was a kind of miserable failure. He was inept and kind of buffoonish. He didn't have the respect of the Nazi officials who were trying to, see if he was like Nazi material. They thought, in fact, one report on his work and his fitness for being the president of the university or the rector of the university was written up and sent to Alfred Rosenberg, who was the chief sort of propaganda minister of the Nazi party. And the report said his thinking is too Jewish. Which is all insane. I mean, that just shows you the level of insanity of the whole discourse. But they were saying it's Talmudic and it's hair splitting and it's incomprehensible. He's of no use to us. I think he was a fish out of water when it came to politics. I'm not saying that to excuse him, but just remember, he was not a player. He was not influential. He didn't have any kind of high office or anything like that. So he had these very childish ambitions to be an important player and figure in Nazism in the Third Reich from the early 30s. I mean, now his rectorship ended and he was kind of disillusioned with how things had gone. He was still loyal to the cause, throughout the war, and maybe never really repented. And I think that's another reminder of what a amoral person he was. He never really seemed to understand the moral dimension of anything that had happened. So he was narcissistic, self-absorbed, totally naive, and inept. So yeah, it's a sad and pathetic and what's the word I'm looking for? Yeah, just sort of horrendous fact about him. He was a nasty piece of work, but I do think he was a genius. So we're stuck with this, and we always will be. Now, one more thing I'll say about this subject about separating the man from the work, as people like to say. People like to say you can't separate the man from the work. It depends on what you mean by separate, because there's all kinds of ways in which we do it all the time, and you have to be able to distinguish the man from the work. Now, people may mean different things when they say separate. Well, what do they mean? We managed to separate Homer from the works of the Iliad and the Odyssey perfectly well because we know absolutely nothing about Homer other than that he was presumably whoever wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey. And that doesn't keep us from talking about and appreciating the Iliad and the Odyssey. So there are cases in which, of course, you can separate the man from the work, or the writer from the work, or the woman from the work. At what point does the awfulness of the person spoil your appreciation of the work? Maybe impossible to write a formula for that. It's going to tell you. It may be a matter of how close you are to this person. I'm sort of glad I didn't live in Germany in the 1930s and had to go to Heidegger's lectures. It may have disgusted me so much I never would have bothered reading a lot of his books. So sometimes historical distance is an advantage. And there were a lot of people who were early on really enthusiastic about Heidegger who abandoned him, rejected him later because they couldn't stomach it. And I can't blame them, really. It's a decision people have to make. But I think as a matter of principle, we often separate the work from the author. And it's a good thing we're able to do that to some extent when we can. And like I say, not every case is the same. There's the Frege cases where it's not hard to separate the work from the person and his prejudices. There's other cases in which there's just no doing it because the work is so totally contaminated that's all that you can't avoid it. Heidegger's case is in between those. It may also be like Wagner, anti-Semitism, and Wagner. That may affect the libretti of the operas sometimes. I don't see how it affects the musical structure of the compositions. I don't know very much about that, so I can't really pronounce on it. But there's not one answer that's going to be right for every single case you can come up with, and Heidegger's is a little bit in the middle. There's a lot more to say about this, about other aspects of his, character and style that occur in his later works, after the war, when Nazism is no longer an issue. But there's still all kinds of potentially reactionary and conservative sort of things that come bubbling up to the surface in what he says. And even there, too, I think sometimes it's obnoxious and sometimes it's conservative, maybe in a very good way, about trying to conserve a variety of ways in which we experience the world and can understand ourselves in the world that are conservative in a genuine way, not in the way it's used in political discourse nowadays. But yeah.
That's very fascinating, and perhaps one of the things to wrap off is to talk about some of Heidegger's influences. What are some of the main movements that he's influenced? And of course, in light of the influences of the movements that he's influenced, what does Heidegger mean to us today in the 21st century?
Oh, that last one is very tricky, but I'll start with the first one. The influences were immediate. The ones that are most well known would be French existentialism, especially Sartre and Merleau-Ponty, in different ways. But I think through Merleau-Ponty especially, the influence then went into what's called structuralism and the post-structuralist tradition in France, because Merleau-Ponty, who read Heidegger very deeply and doesn't refer to him very much, and I think partly because of the political angle, actually. My professor, Bert Dreyfus, talked about when he met Merleau-Ponty and he asked him about Heidegger's influence. And according to Bert, Merleau-Ponty says, it's really Heidegger who's the main influence, even though Merleau-Ponty refers much more frequently to Husserl. But he said Heidegger is the real influence, but you can't say that in print because he was a Nazi and it's not politically correct. Now, that was Dreyfus's story. So Merleau-Ponty was lecturing at the Collège de France, especially in the 50s, and a lot of the later sort of structuralist figures were going to those lectures and listening to Merleau-Ponty. Now, a lot of what they said was kind of reaction against phenomenology. But it's all, as I said before, kind of under the umbrella or under the shadow of Heidegger's influence. Derrida was steeped in Heidegger, and again, it's not that he agreed with Heidegger about a lot of things, but he was in constant sort of conversation with Heidegger. As I said, Sartrean existentialism wouldn't have existed really without Heidegger. Sartre is a kind of, it's another thing Bert Dreyfus used to say, Sartre is a kind of Cartesian Heidegger, if you can make sense of that, a kind of Heidegger that's turned into a Cartesian version of a lot of the same ideas. So interestingly distorted and turned around. But that whole existentialist philosophical movement came out of Heidegger. There's a tradition of philosophical hermeneutics, so-called, which is Hans-Georg Gadamer's phrase, and that's totally a continuation of certain ideas about understanding and interpretation in Heidegger, especially being in time. So hermeneutics in the 20th century very much comes out of Heidegger, rehabilitated that term. It was a bit obscure. And in Being in Time, when he says phenomenology has to be hermeneutical, that sort of ignited this whole subsequent tradition, and Gadamer and Ricoeur and others who talk about hermeneutics from a philosophical angle. So it's not just a theory of textual interpretation, or as it was with Wilhelm Dilthey, a kind of foundation for the human sciences, but it was really meant to be a philosophical idea about our relation to the world, that it's interpretive. So that comes out of Heidegger. There's been so many other things. I keep mentioning my teacher, Bert Dreyfus, used Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty as the basis for a critique of cognitive science and artificial intelligence, and saw the connections with the later Wittgenstein and Dewey and pragmatism, as Richard Rorty did. Richard Rorty, very influenced by Heidegger, and again, thought that Heidegger was saying a lot of the same things that Dewey and Wittgenstein were saying. There's been environmentalist Heideggerians, and yeah, so it's hard to, there's a long list of people. It's almost impossible to refer to, major texts or figures in European philosophy after the 1930s or so that hasn't in one way or another been influenced by Heidegger. Now, where that brings us to 21st century is very hard to say. It's very hard to talk about your own time because you're so close to it. Heidegger, in spite of the Nazi scandal, which is ongoing and which you might have thought would discredit Heidegger and make people just, throw their copy of Being in Time into the garbage and forget about him, it hasn't had that effect at all. I mean, Heidegger is a hot item, and more so than ever. People want to read Being in Time, and they want to know about Heidegger. By the way, how the political stuff gets discussed is different in different countries. It's a much bigger deal in France than it's ever been in the United States. Anyway, I'm not sure about the UK. You can tell me what you think.
It doesn't really touch the UK that much, no. Well, at least not in academia. I mean, it does occasionally with the student bodies, but I don't think the institutions or academia itself has necessarily reacted to I guess the complaints that some students have brought forward. I mean, in Oxford, it's mostly been in kind of in relationship to colonialism and kind of the role that I guess Oxford, as the producer of the British Empire, essentially has in that there's been that kind of pushback, but it hasn't impacted necessarily, I would say, the academic or philosophical side of things.
My experience in American academia now for the last whatever many decades has been that philosophers don't seem that interested in the problem or the question of Heidegger's Nazism. The ones who really don't like Heidegger just don't think he's a good philosopher, and they think it's a lot of gibberish and nonsense, and it's not the kind of so they're much more critical of the philosophical content as they see it, and than the politics of it. That's just in academia, and outside of academia, not too many people know very much about Heidegger. So, and I think I guess historically, it's not that surprising since France was invaded by Germany in the war, and they had a whole complicated history of collaboration and homegrown fascism with the Vichy regime. There's ongoing questions about who was collaborating and who was resisting, and so I suspect a lot of this is fear of the intellectual world being contaminated by fascism and so on. We just never were invaded during the war. England was bombed, but so it's different in different intellectual contexts and so on. So where we are with Heidegger in the 21st century, at least from my perspective, is that people are more interested in Heidegger than ever, and more so. Sometimes these scandalous things like the Nazism just pique people's curiosity, because it's just kind of mind-boggling that somebody who was apparently so smart and so creative and so interesting could have been such a fool or such an odious character. That it's just an enigma. And it's like with Dostoevsky. I don't think it's hurt Dostoevsky's reputation as a novelist that he also happened to have all these terrible anti-Semitic attitudes. So now Heidegger has been used, as I said, for critiques of cognitive science, cognitivism, artificial intelligence. He's been appealed to as a critique of philosophy of mind, maybe even the very idea of mind. I mentioned Gilbert Ryle. His book is called The Concept of Mind. He thinks it's rife with confusions all the way down, and Heidegger is very like that. It's hard to see how our concept of mind even maps onto anything Heidegger's saying. I think he would sort of like to get rid of that idea in that form. I mean, it's already a philosopher's concept, except insofar as it figures into ordinary locutions, like you've been on my mind and I'm in a New York state of mind, or that are just locutions, that are just don't have any philosophical implication necessarily. But the philosopher's concept of mind, I think, is a very dubious concept. It's very questionable how that relates to person. Dasein is much more like our ordinary notion of person than it is like mind. Mind seems to be crying out for a distinction from body, mind and body, but Heidegger never draws that distinction, for example. Anyway, so yeah, where we are in the 21st century with Heidegger, who knows? I mean, I guess we'll see.
Yes.
Yeah,
No, it is quite fascinating.
he's not a relic. He's not a dinosaur, and I don't want to draw too many invidious comparisons, but there are very important philosophers of the 20th century who do not have the kind of status or interest that Heidegger still has, and two of them I will mention. One's a better example, maybe the best example, I'd say, as Ernst Cassirer. Very interesting, very important, very influential philosopher. Not very many people read Ernst Cassirer very thoroughly or seriously or with much excitement. I think even Husserl, who's a very important philosopher and who Heidegger was very dependent upon and influenced by, but broke away from, it's not as much fun to read those others. I think sometimes, the legacy of a philosopher may depend on the readability of the works they leave behind, right? I mean, Aristotle is a good counterexample to that. But, why do we keep reading Descartes' Meditations and Hume's Inquiry? They're brilliantly written, or Fear and Trembling, or the Kant's Groundwork even, or whatever. There are these gems, there's sort of literary masterpieces. That may make a lot of difference in terms of whether people keep reading you, centuries later. It's not the only thing, obviously, but it helps.
Yes. And it's quite funny you raised Dostoevsky, because I was reading, I think it was the Introduction to the Cambridge Companion of Being and Time. Either that or the Cambridge Companion to Heidegger. But apparently Heidegger kept a portrait of Dostoevsky on his desk, which, I mean, if someone I wonder whether anyone, I suppose someone might have thought of it, but I wonder if anyone tried to draw the anti-Semitic links between both of them. That could be quite
Here's the other.
fascinating.
Well, here's the other one thing. The one thing I will say about anti-Semitism is that there was a lot of anti-Semitism. I mean, this is not unique to Dostoevsky or Heidegger,
Exactly.
there's so much of it. I don't want to say it's banal, like it's insignificant. I mean, it's deeply significant, but it's banal and ubiquitous in the sense that it's so commonplace. See, I think what you find about when you find out that Frege or Dostoevsky or Wagner or Heidegger were anti-Semites is how crude and stupid it was, right? That there isn't anything philosophically interesting thing about Heidegger's anti-Semitism, or I think about Dostoevsky's, or Ezra Pound is another example of somebody who was caught up in Italian fascism and anti-Semitism. And he, at least I think, later on came to just see this as complete stupidity. And I think recognizing that is a way of taking some of the wind out of the sails of this, as if it's an exciting enigma or fascinating enigma that Heidegger could have been such a crass anti-Semite. In a way, I think Hannah Arendt had a very good insight into this kind of evil, the banality of it, the shallowness of it. It's important to keep that in mind. Doesn't mean it's not dangerous. It's extremely dangerous, but it's not. It's you over sort of romanticize it if you think of it as being diabolical and fascinating, because it isn't. It's crass and stupid. So sometimes people write about Heidegger's anti-Semitism or his nationalism or something like that as if it must be as interesting as the philosophical ideas he had. There's somebody, Peter Trofny, wrote a book in which he goes on about Heidegger's Seinsgeschichtlicher Antisemitismus, which is a mouthful in German, but it means his history of being. This is something we didn't talk about. Heidegger talks about the history of being, and Trofny talks about the history of being version of anti-Semitism that Heidegger had. And I think this is a complete category mistake, because Heidegger didn't have any new, original, interesting kind of anti-Semitism. He was an anti-Semite, and he had this idea of the history of being, which doesn't trace anything back to Jewish culture. It goes back to the Greeks and Plato mostly. So it has, he was an anti-Semite, and he had this idea about the history of being, but there was no such thing as the history of being kind of anti-Semitism he was promoting. I just think that's an illusion. That's like talking about Cubist misogyny. You can say there are Cubist paintings that are maybe misogynistic. Yeah, okay. But it's not like the Cubist misogyny is a special kind of misogyny. It's just misogyny sort of getting mixed up with this art, this art style and so on. So, yeah, that's one thing I would say about the, don't want to beat a dead horse, but yeah. So anyway, what I mean is that I don't see this as threatening Heidegger's, the interest that people have in Heidegger's philosophy, and that's a good thing. And worrying about the relation it has to Nazism and anti-Semitism is something people will have to do for themselves forever. There's no getting out of it. And there's no ignoring it. I would never downplay it or ignore it.
And that perhaps leads us to the final question is, after this whole interview, and I'm sure people are very interested to learn more about Heidegger. I mean, I really enjoyed reading Heidegger, and after talking about this, I've kind of wanted to get back to my Being in Time, which I think is just hidden on the corner of my... I can
see it. I can see
right
it
there. The Being in Time is managed to get into the crop.
People are chomping at the bit now.
Exactly. How do we get into Heidegger? Because Heidegger is, in some sense, quite a complex person to read. Is there any order you would recommend reading Heidegger? Perhaps you would recommend reading a few commentaries first. I remember I read Dr. Bert Dreyfus's commentary. I think it was, I can't remember the exact
It's called Being in the World.
Being in the World. Yes, I read that, and that was quite helpful. Is there any recommendations you would have for getting into Heidegger in general?
Well, that's a hard question, but I will try to give a good answer. I would say, I wouldn't start with secondary literature. I think you're almost always better off starting with the primary text and then going to the secondary text, because you find out that especially if these are philosophical classics, you find out when you read them for yourself why they're classics, because they're so much more interesting than the secondary literature about them, even if the secondary literature is very good. So what I would say is, get a copy of Being in Time and skip the introductions and start with section 9 under the first chapter of part 1, division 1. Start with that. That's called section 9, and read the first, let's see how many pages this is. Yeah, at least the first about 20 pages. Chapters 1 and chapters 2 of the first division of Being Time, for starters. And if you love it and you're liking it, keep going. But I think that it might be pretty difficult. The other thing I would say to read, oh boy, yeah, there are these essays that he wrote in the 1930s and 40s and 50s, which you might try. It's very hard for me because I've been reading these texts for so long. I don't even remember what I read first, probably Being in Time. I read a lot of Sartre before I had read Heidegger, and maybe that helps in some ways. But I think essays to read, would be and not necessarily after Being in Time, but this is as good as starting at the beginning of section 9 of Being in Time, would be The Origin of the Work of Art, and The Age of the World Picture, and the essay called The Question Concerning Technology. I think those are probably his 3 greatest essays from what's called the later phase of his work, from the 1930s up to the 50s. Those, now, so like I say, I don't know how difficult those will be. They'll probably be very challenging. So then I would say, yeah, look at Dreyfus's book called Being in the World, but also there's a book by Mark Rathall that I think it's called How to Read Heidegger, which is really a short little kind of, one of these little stocking stuffer kind of put in your pocket kind of books, but very, very good. First kind of take on Heidegger, very short, very accessible. I would definitely recommend that. And there's another book by William Blattner, and oh my gosh, what is it called? I think it's it may just be called Being in Time. Blattner has a book on Heidegger, maybe called Heidegger's Being in Time, maybe the title.
Yeah, I think it is it's Heidegger's Being in Time. Yeah.
Heidegger's Being in Time.
Guide.
Yeah, a reader's guide. That's exactly right. So Dreyfus's book, Being in the World, is a pretty hefty, substantial commentary on Being in Time. Rathall's book is a nice, very concise, short introduction to Heidegger. And Blattner's book is somewhere in the middle. It's maybe 200 pages or so, and it's about Being in Time. And I also recommend that. So those 3 secondary sources are very good on Heidegger, generally, mostly Being in Time. That's maybe enough for the beginner.
Yes.
But if you do start with Being in Time, I would say skip the introductions and go straight to section 9, which is the first chapter of the first division. So, and look at chapters 1 and 2 of the first division to start with. You don't really need the introductions to get into that.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for coming onto this channel, and thank you for this recommendation. I really did enjoy a question concerning technology, and I think I'll turn to you also your suggestions on the world picture and etc. And I'm looking forward to that reading as well. Thank you so much for coming on.
Good.
Hopefully this interview would have introduced some of potential Heidegger readers to some of Heidegger's key concepts, aided you in understanding what Heidegger might be meaning if you've read some of Heidegger, or if you're looking into Heidegger, get more curious about Heidegger, which is what the channel is here for. Thank you so much once again for coming on. See you soon, and I'll see you all in the next video. Thank you very much for watching, and see you soon.
Thank you.